that when human beings are socially rejected, areas of the brain that light up overlap significantly with the areas of the brain that light up, that become active when we experience physical pain. Social pain and physical pain are experienced almost identically.
Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. Well, I want to welcome Dr. Tartaglione to the Mental Stillness podcast. I'm glad you're here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Derek. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so why don't you just share a little bit about the work that you do, who you are, where you're from. You don't have to share your blood type. You can if you want. Whatever, whatever you want to share to let us get to know you a little bit.
Well, you know what? I will lead off, because you teed me up for this, with the fun fact that I still don't know my blood type. My wife is absolutely furious with
Well,
me for
I'm
not knowing
asking
my
you
blood
because
type.
I had a recent conversation with my wife where I didn't know, and I ended up texting my mom. So we're both in the doghouse together.
Okay. So I got to figure that out. So that I'll put that on my to-do list. But aside from my blood type, I can tell you a few things about me. My name is JonRobert Tartaglione. Everyone calls me Tat. If you want to call me Dr. Tat or Tat, that's absolutely fine. That's what most of the clients call me anyway. I am a psychologist and behavioral scientist. And really what I've done is I've studied human nature for about 10 years now. And there's been kind of one question that's really been the driving factor behind my studies, and that's what moves people. What moves people to think in particular ways, to behave in particular ways, to decide in particular ways, and more specifically, what are the factors that can contribute to changing the way people do those things? And so I've been studying that for quite some time, and I now take these insights to different clients with my organization Influence 51 and teach them how they can be more effective in their respective industries, and as leaders using these insights in their day-to-day lives.
I don't know. Let's back up a little bit. Like what
Yeah, let's do
from
it.
a um I don't know, from an interest standpoint, is this something you kind of had a pretty clear understanding early on that this is something that fascinated you, or as you got more and more trained, you kind of more, I don't know, discovered more interest along the journey? So share a little bit about what got you here.
I'll take a few steps back, because I think it's important to kind of give you a little bit of background. Neither of my parents had a college degree. Now I always am reticent to talk about this, because a lot of people make this horrible conflation of not having a degree with not being intelligent. That's incredibly incorrect, right? My parents are some of the most intelligent people in the world, but they had never got a degree, and they understood that that can be a disadvantage to some individuals when you go into certain lines of work. And so they always kind of tried to get me to value an education and go get a college degree. Wonderful. I go into college. I went to American University, good university, and I went in law and society. I was interested in law, but I quickly found out that I was less interested in kind of memorizing the laws and more interested in, like, why do we consider this just? And I kind of got shoved into the philosophy department. So I ended up
One of
graduating with a
those.
degree in philosophy. I was one of those. I ended up graduating with a degree in philosophy, and I tease how the job market is very anemic for philosophy majors, but in all sincerity, philosophy is an excellent discipline to teach you how to think, right? What are the right questions to ask? How do you kind of, land on shared definitions, things like that. Um, but philosophy kind of whetted my appetite for this deeper dive into human nature, because a lot of philosophers have different theories about what constitutes human nature, who we fundamentally are. But of course, these are theories, and so I got my degree, and it was kind of like a dog who just caught the mailman. I was like, okay, now what, right? Like this was the goal. Now I have to figure out what I want to do, and in a period of about a year and a half after graduating, I had very little direction. I was actually making most of my money at the time doing comedy writing for a puppet in the Netherlands. That's another story. but it was at this time that I started reading psychology books. First book I ever picked up was Elliot Aronson's book, The Social Animal, which still to this day is the best introduction I've ever had to social psychology, and my favorite book. And it kind of just snowballed from there. I started reading from social psychology to political psychology to behavioral economics to evolutionary psychology, and this interest kind of was born.
One of the things I was very interested in when I think about the audience, the listeners right now, it's they're facing some real, complexities in their own way because people are involved,
Mm,
right? I mean, like, when we talk about
mm,
how do people get how do people move, how do people change, like, all very complex because personalities are involved, experiences are involved, traumas are involved. I mean, fill in the blank. There's just a
mhm,
myriad of it's not a one size fits all. But yet, there's principles that are very evidence-based, that are very interesting, and so I would love why don't you talk a little bit about what are the 5 principles of influence? I'm thinking about leaders and every one of them is trying to influence people, and I
yeah,
think the word leader and influencer is interchangeable. I mean, that's what leaders do, they influence.
mm,
So, what are the 5 principles of
agreed.
influence?
Yeah, so let me first take a moment to acknowledge, right, what you're talking about, because I think this is so important that anytime we're talking about people, we're not talking in certainties. Anyone who says, I know exactly what to do to change that person's mind or make them, choose a different way, they're selling you a lie. They're selling you a fantasy, right? When I go into organizations, I am giving them the empirical tools that we know can give them a percentage of an advantage, right? In kind of guiding someone towards thinking a certain way or being persuaded or being moved to change their behavior or their attitude. And so it's important to think about it like that, right? Like that, this is not a one size fits all thing. We're not talking uncertainties. That being said, um, because my work takes me across industries, I wanted to come up with a framework that was kind of transportable, where I could teach non-academic audiences what's most important when we're talking about influence. And I came up with the 5 principles because I think these cover, while not being exhaustive, cover the most important things, the 5 most important things to understand about people if you want to change the way they think, behave, make decisions. And so, what I'll do is I'll name the 5 principles, and then we can go into further depth about
Let's do it.
any one of them you'd like, Derek. So, principle number 1 is the human brain is not a computer, and this is all about how people have this belief that our brain was optimized for accuracy, for kind of being a truth finding instrument, when in reality it was optimized for survival. And that means that it comes equipped with things like biases and heuristics, and it's driven by emotion and intuition more so than logic sometimes. Principle number 2 is that our social nature matters. Human beings are hyper social individuals. And what that means is that our social context really impacts the way we think and behave. And so sometimes it's not about necessarily appealing to someone's logic to change the way they do these things. It's about making sure that you are embedding yourself in their social environments and curating those in a way that's going to catalyze that type of change. Principle 3 is the one that probably gets the most raised eyebrows, honestly, because people are like, "Is this really something that's deep enough to warrant its own principle?" But principle 3 is that our political sensibilities matter, and what I mean by this is that uh, liberals and conservatives are different types of people. And what I mean by that, this is something we can talk about for a very long time. But we have evidence to show that liberals and conservatives differ philosophically, they differ psychologically, they differ genetically, even neurologically. There was a study done back in 2011 which looked at people's brains in an MRI machine, and they found that just looking at 2 areas of the brain, the amygdala and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, you could tell whether someone was liberal or conservative with 72% accuracy, looking at just 2 brain regions. But the point is, right, is that when it comes to moving someone to think a certain way or do something, you have to acknowledge that their political sensibilities shape their worldviews, shape their value systems, and you need to work within these things if you want a chance of actually connecting with someone. Principle number 4 is our approach matters. And really, what this gets down to is this idea that persuasion is one of the most misunderstood um, processes that we have. People think persuasion is all about creating an argument with great content, and that's part of it. But the thing is it doesn't matter how good your content is if someone isn't in a space where they're willing to entertain an alternative point of view or something that challenges their worldview. And so our approach matters really, really to a
So number
significant
3 and
degree
4 are connected
prior.
with the political sensibilities.
They are connected. Yes, that's correct. And principle 5 is really about context. Principle 5 is that structure and presentation matter. And what we mean by principle 5 is that you can take the same exact data, the same exact message, and tweak it. So you're not saying anything different, but you're saying it in a different way, and you can elicit significantly different reactions from individuals. And so principle 5 goes into things like framing and nudging and things of that nature.
No, that's good. So brain, not a computer. I was kind of taking some notes down. The
Yeah.
sociability, and hyper
Yeah. Yeah.
social, political
Yep.
sensibilities. Talked about persuasion and the approach matters, but then also the framing
Mhm.
and the context. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean that's a very very good list with a lot of side roads that are very interesting to me. Let's go into the first one. I think that's one that's
Yeah.
relatable, and I think it's one that's also, where I find, whether it be people in the clinic or the non-clinical side of things, people understanding the more understanding of the brain that someone has, I think that that's very
Mm.
empowering. How does the brain not being a computer inform you of your work in an organization?
Yeah. So basically, right, this principle is number 1 for a reason. It's number 1 because A, it's one of the biggest misperceptions we have about human beings and human nature in general, but B, it also kind of paves the road for some of the other principles, right? When you get to like something like principle 4, the importance of approach, approach wouldn't matter if our brains were designed as these kind of logical accuracy geared processors, but they're not, right? And it all starts with this idea that let me start off talking about it like this. A lot of people think of human beings as rational creatures. Human beings have the capacity for logic, thinking logically, the capacity for being rational. But we have the tendency, rather than being rational creatures, towards being rationalizing creatures. And it's a really important distinction to make. If human beings were primarily rational creatures in the sense that most people think about rationality, our brains would work kind of like scientists do, where they would take every piece of information available to them, they would evaluate each one of them objectively and impartially, and they would try to render the most accurate, conclusion possible based on the prevailing information. In reality, our brains function much more like a trial lawyer does, and they kind of invert the order of operations here. A trial lawyer who has a particular argument or a particular position it needs to defend, right? And then goes about selecting information that allows them to do that well. And that's kind of how our brains work, where our brains tend to have different beliefs, different worldviews, that different values that we hold very dear. And what it does primarily is it tends to try to find ways to rationalize those things, to provide us with justification and confirmation that those things are indeed true. And so, this is a really fundamental misunderstanding about the brain, and it leads to a lot of frustration in organizations because leaders who are operating on this belief that the brain is this kind of instrument that's designed for accuracy think if I just give the facts right as they are, and the facts are strong enough, then someone's mind is going to change. But that's really oversimplifying what is a much more complicated matter.
And totally negating the amygdala. Right, I mean, when it comes to the
Yeah.
emotional,
Definitely.
I don't know, the emotional, side of the brain, which is, like you said before, is
Yeah,
it's a force to be reckoned with in people, right? For a
it
lot of
is.
reasons.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, so then you get into that's helpful, and so we get into, this idea of persuasion, which is, connected to
Mm.
4, right? For the principle 4?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
so,
Yeah.
how does I don't know, like, how do you define persuasion? How is it commonly
Mm.
misunderstood? What's a healthier way to think
Yeah.
about it? Persuade us
Yeah,
on
these great
persuasion.
these are great questions. So, for me, well, so let me take a step back, right? A lot of people, persuasion is that word that has like this really unfortunate connotation. A lot of people hear persuasion and they think, it's this icky thing, and understandably so, because a lot of the way people tend to use persuasion can be uncouth, right? They go about it in a way that's deliberately self-serving and deliberately self-interested, and so I understand why people have that association with persuasion. But for me, what persuasion fundamentally is it's encouraging someone to consider topics from a perspective they have not considered them from before, to think about ideas in ways that they may have never thought about them before, right? And so persuasion, um, here's how I typically talk about persuasion. Persuasion is incredibly misunderstood because most people believe that persuasion is a battle of arguments. That if I provide you with a strong enough argument, right? That's more logical than yours, is more coherent than yours, then you are going to be forced to take my side. And that's something that a lot of people operate under, but it really misguides us in terms of how brains are actually changed, how attitudes are changed. And I'll give you an example of why that doesn't work, and then I'll talk about a more healthy way to think about persuasion in the brain. Um, Derek, when you see a do not touch the art sign, what's the first thing you suddenly want to do?
It makes me curious. It it doesn't repel me, it draws me in.
That's right. It's
Yeah.
weird, right? We all see a do not touch the art sign and we all have this same impulse that we suddenly want to touch the art. It's this weirdest phenomenon in the world, but it's actually something that's been studied by psychologists. It's called psychological reactance. Basically, when humans feel as if their autonomy is being constrained, that their freedom to do or choose as they wish is being compromised, we instinctively push back. And you can think of reactance almost as kind of like anti-persuasion software that we have. When we feel someone's trying to push us to do something, we stand our ground. Reactance is probably the most important thing to understand when it comes to persuasion because it shows that heavy-handed approaches don't actually persuade people, right? There's an important distinction to make here between true persuasion and compliance. Heavy-handed approaches can generate compliance, especially when there's a power dynamic, right? A leader can go to someone who's quote unquote below them in the hierarchy and say, you need to go do this right now, and they'll do it. Doesn't mean they're persuaded that they believe this is the right thing to do. They're simply complying with a request. Persuasion is actually changing their minds. And this is where things get really interesting because this is where, again, approach really comes in critically because I like to make this analogy when I work with clients that the most effective way you can think about another person's brain is as private property. And what I mean by that is imagine that you're sitting in your front yard, okay, and you're gardening. You're in your garden, you're tending to your garden in your front yard. I walk by holding a beautiful plant, one of the most beautiful plants you've ever seen, right? But without asking your permission, I jump the fence, okay, bust into your front yard, run to the other side of your garden, and start trying to plant this plant in your garden. How are you going to react to me, right? Are you going to be happy? Are you going to let me do my thing? Are you going to be a little bit
Yeah, I'm
defensive?
gonna sick my children on you. Let them
You're gonna sick, you're gonna sick
Yeah,
children on me, right? You got to call the cops. You're going to be
yep.
defensive, probably a little bit hostile, and rightfully so. And this is kind of the example I'll start off with when I talk about persuasion and the misunderstandings around it, because in the same way that you would get defensive to someone barging onto your property in that manner, so too do people get instinctively defensive when you try to change their minds when they're not ready to hear the argument, when they're not ready to have their minds changed or challenged, their views challenged. And the reason I talk about having that beautiful plant, right, is because it's important to understand that just like it doesn't matter how pretty the plant I was trying to plant in your garden is, it doesn't matter how good your argument is. It doesn't matter how sound your argument is if someone is not ready to hear it. And so persuasion, I use this idea of kind of thinking about another person's brain as private property because the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out ways to be invited onto that property, right? You need to create a space where someone is comfortable with you, where they trust you, where they believe they're not going to be judged for their opinions or their beliefs before they're willing to have an honest and vulnerable, quite frankly, conversation about what those are and consider changing them. And so this is really why persuasion starts with your approach and why so many minds are usually not changed because people ignore that to begin with.
So, I know you're currently not in America. We're in s
No, I'm not. I'm
you're
in
in
London.
London. We're in the middle of
Yeah.
like midterm elections and all that. And
Yeah.
when I think of persuasion in the climate that we're in right now, it's like you turn on the TV or the listen to podcasts, you're getting ads, right? And so, why are so many people influenced by the millions and millions of the political ads to persuade them one way or the other politically? If they're kind of stuck in their ways,
Yeah.
conservative, liberal, they're
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
hardline. Like, I don't know. Like, talk about that.
Yeah. It's an excellent question, right? And what we have to do is we have to take a step back and understand what political campaigns are actually trying to do. Okay. Because the vast majority of political advertising um, is geared towards rallying a base who already agrees with you to go out and vote. Okay. So a lot of the advertising actually isn't geared towards persuasion. It's geared towards mobilization, right? It's geared towards kind of activating those who already agree with you.
It's like a
And the
reminder, like,
reason
hey,
for
don't
this
forget to vote. Don't forget to go out. Like, okay.
exactly. Exactly. And the reason why so many resources are geared towards that is because we have some pretty fascinating but also disheartening research to show that there are large percentages on both sides. Not as large as some people believe, but large enough to make you say, "Oh, that's unfortunate," who cannot be persuaded to vote for the other side. No matter what you do, they are quite literally in many ways unpersuadable. And we say that because there are studies that were done. Drew Weston and colleagues did some pretty famous studies where like they basically gave individuals partisans statements made, real statements, by the way, made by political leaders. And for some of them, they showed kind of leaders of their own party making contradictory statements. And for others, they showed leaders of the opposing party making contradictory statements. Now, when they were shown the ones for the opposing party, they were very quick to be able to identify that, hey, that's contradictory and to punish those people for that. When their own party was making the contradictory statements, what's really interesting, right, is they did fMRI imaging as these people were going through this. There was discomfort, okay, like kind of a flicker of discomfort in their brains, meaning they realized that this was contradictory, right? They realized that what their leader had done, what was did not make sense or was illogical or didn't align with what they said earlier. But once they found ways to justify that, to rationalize why they did that. Well, the reason they did that is because, they thought this way, but they changed their mind. Whatever flimsy excuse they came up with, what happened was not only did that discomfort disappear, but reward centers of the brain became active, meaning it's quite literally rewarding for really strong partisans to justify bad behavior from their group. And so the point being, it's very, very hard to move certain people. There are certain people in the middle that can be moved, but most political campaigning is geared towards mobilizing those that are already decided, right? When it comes to actually persuading people, this is where it becomes really challenging. And part of probably the most challenging part of persuading people is the fact that most political persuasion or attempts at political persuasion happen on platforms and in forums where it's least likely to actually occur. And what I mean by that is things like social media. Social media, in and of itself, is perhaps the platform where change is least likely to occur because of the social implications, okay, from your group, from your tribe, if you were to entertain the merits of another side's
The
argument, right?
consequence.
In those environments, exactly. In those environments, right? If you and I were having an argument, we were on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, right? If we were in private and we created the right space where we trusted one another, maybe if I started changing my mind, I could acknowledge that I was having doubts. I could acknowledge the merits of your point of view because there's no social repercussions of doing that. But in these public forums, right? Part of the reason that change almost never happens on a Facebook thread or an Instagram thread or something like that is because people know that there are negative consequences, social consequences, if I, as a representative of my group, acknowledge that maybe the enemy, the other side, isn't so bad or isn't thinking as illogically as we try to make them out to be. That's one of the biggest challenges is these are happening in the wrong
Hmm.
forums.
So to take it a step further, the people who are a bit more
Yeah.
malleable and are
Yeah.
willing to, I guess, compromise or budge or be changed, do you feel like that comes down to, and I know I'm not trying to make an overgeneralization, but do you feel like
No, no, no.
personality type comes into play? I don't know, like, if you have a broader social circle where you have a broader perspective, like, I would
Yeah.
imagine that's in there as well. So what do you feel like some of the ingredients, and even if you had to just based on, I'm not saying you have to have an evidence behind it, but just from your
Yeah. Yeah.
opinion or whatever, like, what do you think some of the ingredients are for the people who are willing to
Yeah,
change?
no, I mean, I th I think you're hitting on some of them, right? Like, what we're talking about a confluence of a bunch of different factors. And it's hard to give a generalization. I appreciate you kind of giving that caveat, but personality will play a role, right? Like some people, there are personality kind of like these psychometric factors that we can look at, like cognitive rigidity, right? Like how willing are you to be flexible or rigid in the way you go about thinking about the world or thinking about right and wrong, and do we do it in black and white terms or in gray terms, and like, things like that certainly contribute. Experiences definitely contribute as well, right? There are certain experiences that kind of open people up to different ways of thinking, different points of views. Things like travel can be transformative for people because they go from this kind of dogmatic view of this is the world and this is what people do or who people are, to going to something that violates those expectations, and they come to realize, okay, these people live differently, right? Culturally they're differently, and yet it's not that they're wrong, it's just different, right? And so these experiences can be transformative for people because it kind of opens up their idea that, okay, maybe right and wrong isn't as black and white as I thought it once was. So there are elements like that can certainly play a role when it comes to flexibility, but it certainly is, I guess the best way I can describe, kind of this middle ground of individuals, the persuadable, so to speak. I think most people are more likely to be able to find common ground with the other side, with moderates on the other side, right? Because the percentage of moderates on both sides is much, much larger than people realize. We just don't we misperceive it because extremes on both sides tend to be the mouthpieces, right? And so we think, oh, the other side must think like this and must think like that. These are just the loudest people in the room. There's a lot of moderation on both sides, and so there's a lot of opportunity for them to kind of find areas where they can compromise and agree. But again, the social consequences of doing that can be quite large. But I would say there's more opportunity to find agreement without kind of changing whether I'm liberal or conservative than there is of actually kind of shifting someone who's liberal to being conservative or conservative to being liberal.
I would imagine too, another, just as you're talking, like, another ingredient might even be, I guess, more inwardly looking of recognizing, "Hey, you know what? Like, maybe there's a self-awareness factor there of like, I haven't seen all the things, I don't understand all the things, like a growth mindset might be an ingredient as well of, "Hey, you know what? Like, I'm open to hearing something different and actually looking at that, f fairly."
I think so, and I think my father actually is a great example of this. My father, um, especially as he's gotten older, and I always tell him how much I admire this about him because it's really is a rare trait, right? Like we all have political inclinations and intuitions, right? Like we see something happening on the news and we have a gut reaction that kind of tells us whether this is right or wrong, whether I agree with this or disagree with this, whether it be an incident or a policy or whatever have you. Um, and most of us just take that kind of intuition, that emotional reaction we have as self-evident of why this is right or why this is wrong. And there are some people like my father and the type of people you're alluding to, right? Who want to question and want to understand why they have that reaction, right? Where did it come from? Is it experience? Is it emotion? Is it social learning? Is it kind of cultural imprinting? But they kind of have this desire, which is so rare because it's uncomfortable to say, although I feel like I'm right about this, although I have this feeling of certainty, where is this feeling coming from and is it really justified, right? What are the other ways to look at this and have I considered them? And that's a really rare thing to do because it's a vulnerable thing to do. It's not easy. It's much easier to go through life thinking this is my gut feeling, I know I'm right, and I don't want to even consider anything to the alternative.
I like how you just said earlier, like, creating the space for real conversation to happen where people are actually transformed and not just, the compliance part, and I think when we think about leadership and it's such a trap that I see leaders fall into, especially whenever, for whatever reason, their back's against the wall. They feel like they really got to turn the quarter around. They've got to get some results in here, or there. Like the temptation is to go force compliance. You know, what does it look like to truly have lasting change? Is a different approach that needs to be taken. And so, let's shift gears a little when it comes to what are some common misconceptions leaders, have about motivation and behavior change in people?
I'll give you a few examples. We've touched upon two of the big ones already. Two of the big ones are things like thinking that people are inherently logical and they're going to be moved by logical arguments and not understanding the importance of approach, right? These are two big ones already. There's a few others I'll get to, and I'll cover them in turn. Excuse me. The first one has to do with the power of story. Um, Human beings really underestimate how powerful stories are for catalyzing change. Um, and we're talking about it, right? A lot of the leaders I work with, when they have to make a big change, when the pressure is on, they go in and they're leading with data and they're leading with statistics, and they're thinking this is going to move someone. What's really interesting, especially when you don't have you don't have people that you can just kind of boss around, and B, if you have people who kind of disagree with you that you're trying to genuinely change their mind. Stories have some really serious advantages from a research perspective. Um, what I am giving, if you and I disagreed on something, Derek, right, and I am giving you my arguments, your inclination is to be thinking in your head about your counter arguments, right? If I'm giving you data that supports my side, your instinct is to start thinking about data that will corroborate your side. These are kind of just of pretty natural inclinations that we have. Stories do something really interesting when it comes to our psychology. Whereas arguments tend to inspire counter arguments, when people listen to stories, what they tend to do is two things. They tend to simulate and they tend to empathize. Okay. They tend to, when it comes to simulation, they think about what that other person was going through, that character in the story what was experiencing, and they empathize, right? They kind of vicariously experience the emotions or the feelings that they were going through. And Researchers refer to this as narrative transportation theory. And basically, stories are kind of almost this. Uh, this isn't the most flattering way to put it, right? But it's almost this kind of Trojan horse that you can kind of get your point across without the type of natural resistance that you would typically get. Stories have this really interesting hold on us. The challenge I find, so first and foremost, one of the things that I train leaders to do is I train them to lead with stories, right? To connect before you try to convince. Because ultimately, what we find in the research, I'll give you a really quick example. You go back 2,000 years, okay? Plato had this idea that the human brain, when it's working properly, is like a charioteer and two horses, where the charioteer is reason and the horses are emotion and desire. And Plato said when the brain is working well, reason is in control. It's reining in emotion and desire. This has become kind of an obsession, okay, with thinking about how the brain works for the past 2,000 years or so. Over the past 3 or 4 decades in cognitive neuroscience, new models of the brain, more accurate models, have started to emerge. One of which talks about the brain as an elephant and a rider, where the elephant is emotion and the rider, this little tiny person at the top, is rationality, right? Where emotion kind of drives most of our thinking and decisions. And then we try to find ways to rationalize it, as we talked about with principle number one. That's why stories are so powerful. Stories connect with us emotionally. And once we connect with someone emotionally, then once they're aligned with us on that, they start looking for data to justify their feelings, right? And so you want to connect before you try to convince. The other thing about stories that leaders tend to do poorly is I will often approach a leader and I'll say, hey, tell me a story you were going to tell your team if you wanted to motivate or inspire them, right? And invariably, they turn to a story of success. They'll talk about the time they closed the big deal or won the big account. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but they leave out something really important. They leave out the failure before the success. And the way I try to explain why that's less potent, okay, than telling the full story is I say, imagine, are you familiar with the Rocky series, the Rocky
I am.
movies? All right. My dad, every time Rocky comes on, my dad is
Let
in
me
his
go get my
chair, he's
sweatsuit
pumping
on,
his fists.
right?
Oh, he feels like he's in the ring, right? But Rocky inspires a lot of people, right? It's a very inspirational movie series for a lot of people. And I'll say to the leader, I'll say, imagine we sat down to watch Rocky 2 or Rocky 3. But instead of watching the entire movie, I fast forward to the last 20 minutes. Okay. Rocky wins the fight, raises his arms, the credits roll. Is that going to inspire and motivate you in the same way as watching the whole movie? And of course, the answer is no, right? Because what makes movies like Rocky inspiring is not that he won, it's that here's someone who was beat up, knocked down, counted out, and refused to lose. In the same way, people are inspired by leaders they think are infallible, who have just won and won and won. They're inspired by, they resonate with leaders who have lost, who have failed, but have still reached the status and the position they're in. And so a lot of leaders aren't telling the wrong stories. They're telling the right stories in the wrong way. They're leaving out the most critical ingredient, which was this vulnerability, this weakness that they think weakens their story, but it actually strengthens motivation. And so I'll pause there
Yeah, no.
because
Mm.
I want to make sure I answer any questions we
No,
might
that's
have.
great, and I think the temptation for leaders to do that is, they're telling the story, they're wanting to inspire, they're wanting to oftentimes change outcomes, they're wanting to get the victory, and it's like, "Well, let's go to the victory. Here's a recent victory, or here's the most powerful victory I experienced," but to get them there, you've gotta have the backstory, you've gotta have the context, and so having that, that's very practical when we think about that, and that vulnerability word, I mean, the listeners are gonna know that creeps up in almost every episode because the humanity part is so important of being able to constantly remind and define leadership as we're humans. We have those mistakes, those flaws, the vulnerabilities is so important to lean into, not lean away from or run away from. Um,
Absolutely.
so, we're talking about the a ton about the social implications of when we're interacting with other people. So let's talk a bit about social pain. Social pain experienced, it's something that I think you even talk about this, but is it true that social pain is experienced in a similar way to physical pain?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is one of the most fascinating findings. This blew my mind when I first read about it. But basically, about 25 or so years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, a young man named Kip is kind of sitting in the quad on his college campus. A frisbee lands next to him. Okay, so he grabs the frisbee, picks it up, turns around, sees another young man calling for it from across the quad. So he tosses them the frisbee, and the young man catches it and says, "Hey, nice throw, man," and tosses it back to Kip. So Kip catches it and he gets excited because he thinks he's going to be invited to go play frisbee with this young man and his friends. So, smile on his face, he tosses the frisbee back, and much to his dismay, the young man catches it, turns around, and walks away, leaving Kip standing there feeling kind of foolish, right? So he sits down and he's struck by this feeling. He's really bothered by that interaction. He's bothered A by the fact that he was kind of rejected by this young man and his friends when he thought he was going to be invited to go play, but he's also bothered by the fact that it bothered him at all. Why the heck should he care what this total stranger, treated him like? He was so struck by this feeling that he decided to investigate it. Okay. And so he and his colleagues, who happened to be researchers in neuroscience at the time, they invented this paradigm called cyberball. Basically, what it is imagine that you were a participant in Kip's lab. Okay. You come into the lab, you're greeted by Kip. He ushers you into a back room. He sits you in a chair where they hook you into an fMRI machine that monitors your brain as you go through a task. And he puts a screen in front of you. And on the screen, there's three avatars. Okay. There's one at the bottom in the middle. You control that avatar. And there's two other avatars that are controlled by other people in separate rooms. He says, in a moment, you're all just going to play a game of catch. Okay. You three, a ball's going to come on the screen. You're going to play a game of catch. Long story short, ball comes on the screen. For the first 30 seconds or so, you're passing the ball around, having a decent time. After 30 seconds, something weird happens because, unbeknownst to you, the actual participant, those other two players aren't players at all. They're computer programs, and they were designed to exclude the participant after 30 seconds. So, for the final 30 seconds of this game, you're left sitting there watching what you think are two other players pass this ball back and forth and leave you out. And after 30 seconds, you leave and they thank you for your participation. You go home. Well, Kip and his colleagues analyzed those brain scans, and what they found, which you alluded to already, was absolutely fascinating. They found that when human beings are socially rejected, right, the areas of the brain that light up overlap significantly with the areas of the brain that light up, that become active when we experience physical pain. At the level of the brain, social pain and physical pain are experienced almost identically. And there's a reason for this. There's an evolutionary reason for this. If we were to go back 50,000 years, into our evolutionary past, there were predators we could not survive one on one. Okay. We couldn't fight off certain predators one on one. There was prey like woolly mammoths that we couldn't take down by ourselves. And what this means is that in those environments, if you were cast out of the group, if you were kicked out and socially excluded, it was basically a death sentence. Okay. You could not survive on your own. And so humans have evolved to experience social rejection and social pain in the same way as physical pain because both of them represent a threat to our survival.
It is a fascinating field of research, and I love that story of Kip, and I'm glad you went to the backstory of it, and I and in our daily lives, it's like we see this when we go to a movie and we see someone going through a great triumph like Rocky or having their heart broke, like, I'm sitting there crying as I'm eating the popcorn. It's like there's a social response, or we're at a stadium and the wide receiver goes to catch it, and I'm making the motion as if I'm on the field catching the ball. It's like,
Yeah,
there's the
yeah.
mirror neurons is a real thing, and so when we think about, back to leadership, when we walk in a room and we respond to things, whether it be the celebration and a great accomplishment or the other side of it where we've fallen short, like, our response matters. Like, we're given those social cues of to our team, and, um, it's really important for leaders to understand the magnitude of what they're modeling. I guess. So would you say anything about that from a leadership standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, a lot of leaders tend to view things like inclusion, belonging, a sense of social connection as kind of a nice thing to have, right? Like it's okay if we don't have it, whatever, but it's more of a nice, add-on if we
It's the
can
cherry
get
on
there.
top, right?
It's the cherry on top. There is a plethora of research to show that these things have an impact on bottom line. As a matter of fact, I like to kind of use this metaphor, right? That social disconnection, people feeling like they're not included, like they're ostracized, like they're not part of the group, it is a tax on your talent. Okay, that's ultimately what it comes down to, and it has real impacts on things like the bottom line. We have research to show that socially disconnected employees are less engaged, they're less productive, they're less able to stand up to challenges. They tend to respond to challenges with more pessimism, apathy, and avoidance. We have research to show that socially disconnected individuals actually don't think as critically well as their more connected peers. There's this really I'll give you a quick example. There's this really fascinating and kind of funny study that was done where they gave participants a personality test. I'm putting that in air quotes because literally what these researchers did is they randomly gave them one of two pieces of feedback. They said for some of them, based on your personality score, you're likely to have a rich social life in the future and be surrounded by a network of friends and family. For the others, they said based on your personality score, you're likely to be quite lonely in the future, right? And it's a kind of a mean thing to do, but they were testing and they debriefed them afterward. They told them the truth afterwards, but before they told them the truth, they had them take an SAT style test. And they found that the ones that received the negative responses about their kind of social futures scored, I think it was like 30 percentage points lower on that test, got 30% of those questions incorrect relative to their connected peers in this very simple manipulation, right? And so it's not just that it hurts people's feelings, quote unquote, it's that it actually impacts how critically your people think, how well they do about things like understanding information, integrating data, and actually being able to kind of critically evaluate things. Social disconnection has kind of a reach into all of those domains. And ultimately, it does impact things like revenue and bottom line.
This conversation's been enriching, and I know people are going to lean into it. And so, from people being able to follow your work, understand you a bit more, like how do they stay in touch with you? How do they follow you? Won't you plug all the things?
I appreciate you offering that to me. I have found I am awful at plugging my work. As a one person operation, I just feels icky doing that self promotion. But best place you can find information on what I do is the website influence51.com. That's influence51.com. A lot of stuff on there. You'll get a better idea of what it is I do, how I work with organizations, how I do one on one skill building with individuals, and a lot of free content too. A lot of just free essays, articles, newsletters, things like that. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. If you can figure out how to spell my name, you can connect with me on
I'll put it in the
LinkedIn.
show notes for those that are intimidated.
I am often on LinkedIn begrudgingly. I don't like LinkedIn as a platform because I feel like it's just a bunch of people trying to like be their own guru and this like kind of pseudo profundity. And it's not I just like teaching people about psychology and behavioral science. And so you can connect on LinkedIn. You can ignore my posts if you want, but if you ever want to actually have a conversation, reach out, send me a message. Always happy to talk about these things. You'll probably be the one to leave the conversation first because I can go on these things for a long time.
That's great. Well, I definitely encourage you to check out Dr. Tartaglione's content, and really appreciate your insights and your the way in which you connect it to the real world, which is really important to take it out of the clouds and make it applicable, which we've talked about offline and really helped guide this
Yeah.
conversation. So really appreciate your time and being a guest on the Mental Stillness podcast.
Derek, it's been my pleasure. It's been one of the most engaging conversations I've had in a long time. And so thank you for all that you do. And thanks for having me on.